This guy was incredibly strong, one of the strongest that ever existed. He ended up dying in his last battle. After that, you can already imagine. Our badass came back in the body of a teenager who was very weak. But with his power, he is going to haunt everyone, striking sword blows to their heads. At the top of the hill on the eve of sunset, an explosion occurs. This ended up raising a great amount of dust. And at the center of that mess, two men are playing with swords. The attacker has several scars on his face, and the one defending the blow is unimpressed by his power. In fact, the old man is impressed that the young man can still move after being wounded. His mental strength is very high and fits very well with his sword style, the ghost style. Because of that, the old man had to acknowledge that this technique is truly very good. But it wasn't enough for it to be good to pressure that old man, who seems to be gaining the upper hand in the fight. With his opponent wounded, he said that he couldn't use internal energy and that it's already a miracle he can still move. After gathering his internal energy into the sword, the old man said the battle would soon be over, as he was about to take the young man's life. He began to advance furiously, throwing a great power of internal energy at the young man. Even though he was severely injured, the young man managed to defend himself from that blow. But he was immediately caught off guard by the old man's approach, who managed to land a kick to his stomach, throwing the young man's body far away, driving him across the ground. He was nearly pierced by the old man's sword, which was lodged in the ground. Now that they were close, the young man managed to surprise the old man, and with just one kick, he disarmed him of his sword. The young man with scars on his face is still carrying his blade, showing great determination. He tried to thrust at the old man, but the elder dodged easily. However, realizing the great risk, his face was wounded by the strike. Immediately, he was surprised by a punch from the young man, who struck his face forcefully. Now it was the old man who was thrown to the ground like a sack of garbage. He didn't like getting beaten like that, and gathering his internal energy into one hand he'd make the young man pay. But as soon as he executed his attack, he was surprised. There was nothing in front of his eyes. While wondering where the young man had gone, that same young man was about to surprise him from behind. That's when the old man realized he should have stayed retired playing Sudoku at home, because his body was separated into two nearly symmetrical halves. After that, the white-haired man seemed to sigh in relief. He asked if the ghost swordsman had managed to defeat that old demon, and the man with the scars on his face replied that yes, he had. Now that he was dead, the bloodbath could end and the Shaanxi massacre would finally come to a close. He looked at the bodies on the ground and called them idiots, saying they showed up claiming to be black knights and had killed many people in the past 3 days. Thanks to that, the world witnessed the alliance of two rivals, the Orthodox faction and the unorthodox one. Hearing these words, a long-haired man called the ghost swordsman by name Dako Hien. The promise they made to duel after developing their techniques might be one he won't be able to fulfill. And the ghost swordsman asked if that was what he was going to say before dying. The other long-haired man said they had dedicated their entire lives to the sword. He fought against many martial artists, witnessed many techniques, but never saw anything as precise as the ghost technique. That guy's devotion was greater than everyone else's. That's the reason he could make this request, and the ghost swordsman wanted to know what it was. That's when the long-haired man said he had a disciple in the Manhwa sect. The more he listened to these words, the more the ghost swordsman became irritated. He asked if his friend was going crazy from dying because he was making that request to the best unorthodox swordsman. Didn't make any sense. But without saying a word, the long-haired man handed him an artifact, saying the spirit of the plum tree was with him and asking the ghost swordsman to deliver that relic to the sect leader. The scared young man even tried to question it, but went silent. His friend was already very short of breath. That's when he realized that the long-haired man was about to find out whether God existed. The ghost swordsman also said he was risking his own life. This was a difficult request to fulfill. The long-haired man said they were the only friends they had, and though it was awkward to admit that, he was very grateful. And the scared young man said he should be because of that request. He would now spend the rest of his life on that mountain. That's when the internal energy in the young man's body began to destabilize, causing something horrible to witness. His body was no longer in one piece. His life was over. The ghost swordsman was still in shock from witnessing it firsthand. Without realizing, there was another source of energy nearby approaching him. It was coming like a slash, quickly closing in. As the attack neared, the swordsman began to grow angry. He was furious about what he had just seen. With his sword in hand, he wanted to know who was responsible for that. And executing one of his techniques, he managed to block the incoming attack. He calmly observed what was in front of him. A masked man appeared to be responsible. And unlike what the ghost swordsman expected, that man carried no sword at all. After defending himself, the scarred man started to feel confused, noting that the figure before him manipulated energy with great mastery. It didn't take long for huge explosions to occur on that plateau, heading toward where the ghost swordsman was. The dust raised by it spread across the entire summit. In the midst of the dust is the ghost swordsman, who was severely injured by those attacks. He was still trying to understand how this happened, and how someone so strong could be walking this earth. At that moment, he realized that if he were left-handed, he wouldn't be able to write his name. That masked man. He thought he was the master of the Black Knights. But now the young man began to doubt because he thought he had defeated that master, and his body wasn't far from there. He began to wonder if this could be a hidden disciple, or worse, maybe this one was the real master. And feeling the pain of his wounds, he was sure this was a much more powerful opponent. Even though he was weakened from the last battle, it was impressive that he had lost an arm to an attack made purely of demonic energy. Thus, he began to apologize to his friend as he hadn't even had the chance, to take his body back to his homeland to be buried. Even though he was full of regret, this warrior had determination, and he was determined not to give up. Standing up, he said he would fulfill his part of the promise. He began to run toward the cliff. He didn't know if he would survive the fall after losing an arm, but it was his only option. Looking back, he acknowledged that he was running from that fight, but he wouldn't forget that person, and the next time they met would be the last. It was just as he finished that thought that his body was cut into 2 pieces. The young man tried to understand why things were turning upside down, realizing that as he fell from the cliff, his legs were going in another direction, and the one responsible was that masked figure. The young man no longer had the strength to say anything, and as he fell into oblivion, he didn't want that masked man to be smiling about it. He began to apologize to his friend for not being able to keep his promise. That's when the artifact he had placed on one of his arms began to glow. A great source of energy was emanating from his body, and the young man began to think that heaven was helping in that situation. He could feel his pulse again. But as soon as he started to open his eyes, he was no longer in that place. Some people were telling him to wake up, calling him senior disciple. Trying to wake up, he found it very strange to be called that way. One of those present told Baek Jin that the senior disciple had finally opened his eyes. Approaching the young man, he said he had done well to survive, and now he needed to stay with them. That's when our boy realized he knew that man. The old man had done the best he could with acupuncture and didn't expect it to work. Our boy knows that this elder is Baek Jin, the leader of Mount Hua, and the old man asked him to stay strong, calling him Mu Hui. That's when our young man remembered the identity of that name. It belongs to the 2nd generation of disciples, being the personal student of Hyunjo. He just doesn't know why he's being called that. The old man must have gone crazy that he remembered that artifact. He began to talk about the light he had seen before, and the boy next to him didn't understand. He simply said his wounds hadn't healed yet and he should avoid speaking. Without understanding what had happened, our boy realized he had a lot to figure out. After recovering a bit, he was already able to walk, and someone asked if he was going out. Our boy confirmed, though he almost gave a rude answer. Old Baek Jin agreed, saying it wasn't a bad idea to move the body a little, but he warned that he should take it easy, because aside from recovering over the past week, he hadn't been able to eat properly. The boy went to a lake outside, and upon arriving, he washed his own face, while thinking that only 7 days had passed since everything happened. The feeling he had was that it had felt like an entire year. And in the past 7 days, he had dreamed he lived a different life. Memories from that body and from the training of that sect from the past 20 years of Muhui's life. He also saw a massive attack that happened in that place. Everything was on fire and enemies were everywhere. It was during that moment that his body was struck by a blade. Our protagonist found that behavior incredibly foolish. Since the owner of that body was very weak, he shouldn't have acted that way. Certainly, because of that wound, he ended up dying. Then he started to remember that mysterious light that came from the artifact he had received, though he didn't know why he was chosen, much less why he ended up in that guy's life, and not in the body of Hyunjo. He started thinking maybe it was fate's doing, but that only made him sigh even deeper. He may not like what happened, but he couldn't ignore the fact that he had been given another chance at life, and he couldn't waste it. That masked bastard, he was definitely going to find him and cut him to pieces. He was definitely a much stronger enemy than the master of the Black Knights. He would have lost to him even if he hadn't been injured. So if he wants a chance to defeat him, he needs to become even stronger than he ever was before, the boy said as he climbed some stairs, reaching the building ahead of him. As he approached the altar, he remembered his friend's words, asking him to take care of his disciple. In the memories of that body, he also recalled other moments from the attack, where the disciples were being encouraged to protect the sect. Our boy started picking up some books, promising that his friend didn't need to worry about anything, because he would make sure to fulfill that promise and avenge his death no matter what. The elders realized they would need to rebuild 8 pavilions, as they weren't able to control the fire in time, and their leader presumed they didn't have enough money left. Beck confirmed that resources were scarce and that profits and visitors to the place would be reduced for a while. This news worried the elders. Baek knew they had to avoid big expenses, so he decided to prioritize the most important pavilions. Then he asked how the disciples' recovery was going. Baek Jin replied that everything was going well. Even the seriously injured were already recovering. The leader was pleased by this news and asked specifically about Mu Wei, since the news about Hyunjo wasn't good. The old man said the boy had received more than he expected, and that his recovery was going very well. He had even managed to walk outside. Knowing this, the leader was glad for the good news, but warned that it was wise to check on the boy from time to time, since they knew what kind of young man he was. He believed the boy might just be pretending to be better, though deep down he hoped he really had improved. And inside that library, our boy was there reading all those books, learning techniques he had never seen before, that made him remember events from his past life. He had already been to that place with his friend, who asked what he thought of the disciples. Our boy's direct answer was that they were completely useless. His friend agreed, stating that the sex technique was regressing. Those people were just fooling themselves into thinking they had reached the pinnacle of the sword, which in truth was the very control of variables and illusions that made the plum blossom bloom. He told our boy that he should already know this. A sect that cannot develop new paths is doomed to failure. And that was certainly true, but still, forcing change wasn't a solution. So our boy asked if the long-haired man had any ideas to solve that problem. and the long-haired man confidently replied that he would show them how it's done. That the blooming sword technique wasn't all there was a new level they hadn't yet reached. That's when our boy asked if that's what he meant when he suggested they should create a sword technique of their own, so they could duel in the future. All that is now just a memory, and you began to remember how he felt when he first saw those disciples. He thought the problem was in the sect itself, that even though it was renowned and famous, it couldn't produce many talents. Hyunjo had been the last in hundreds of years. But now the boy realized that was a shallow thought. After reading those techniques, he saw that they were flawless. And martial techniques grow stronger with time as they pass through others. That is the power of a sect. And this one had hit a blockage from growing too large. So he began to think about the technique his friend hadn't been able to complete, taking on the responsibility to finish it in his place as a way of fulfilling his promise. And that technique needs to drink from Manhua's source. The shape of its movements and intent must be aligned with the sect. It all begins with the boy learning that place's principles, starting from the basics so he could later reach his friend's sword technique. He began to meditate, focusing his internal energy. That process was to erase what that body had learned, because when he tried to learn, it would be different, since the knowledge of that body wasn't his. Not to mention he couldn't underestimate the technique just because it was basic. Autumn circulation was a refined and very stable technique. In his past life, he relied on what was unorthodox. But Manhua's sword techniques were very different, and he might end up learning something new. The life of the sword's ghost, who cared only about the blade, had changed. From now on, his name is Mu-Hui. Time passed, and our boy remained inside studying. Another disciple of the sect was heading toward the same building. Before going in, he found something strange. The place was closed, and from outside he started shouting, asking if the senior disciple was inside. Our boy had to interrupt his meditation session because of that, so he got up to open the door, coming face to face with the concerned disciple outside. His expression looked very tired, and our boy asked if his name was Mu-Chiel, and what brought him there. The young man said it had been 3 days since our boy left the infirmary, and he still hadn't shown up for training sessions. This news surprised our boy. He had no idea that 3 days had passed, which left him deep in thought. He quickly remembered he hadn't eaten properly for a week. He started recalling when he was trapped in the blood sect storm and their flawless techniques. He told the boy he didn't know so much time had passed and that he would return with him to the training hall. But that young man looked at our protagonist a bit suspiciously, sensing there was something very different about him, while our protagonist thought to himself that a drink would be great right now. In the training hall, someone was giving orders to all the disciples, showing them how to execute that sword technique. All the students were trying to mimic the strikes as best as they could, while the instructor went around correcting them. He had asked Miriam to raise her arm a bit more, and the girl said she would do it that way. As soon as he got there, our protagonist realized everything was just as he expected. The students were still terrible as always, so bad they couldn't maintain balance, which completely disrupted their weight distribution. That way, they couldn't put any power into their strikes. Besides that, their posture was crap. They were failing at the basics. Even though it was a complete mess, he noticed that the instructor wasn't actually that bad, and he began to wonder if that one was named Mu Jin. At the very least, there was one competent person in that place, someone who seemed committed to educating the students. He must also be a serious disciple. Now he started to wonder why that young man was doing all this, knowing that the original owner of that body was likely very shy. He also didn't have many leadership or martial skills. Unlike Mu Jin seemed to know how to lead others, had a calm personality, and showed great potential. Naturally, the new students would want to listen to him. Those with talent and skill get opportunities, so our boy didn't have much to do in response to that. At least he hadn't had any reason to intervene, until now. That was when Mu Jin signaled that the training was over. The students seemed very tired, feeling like Mu Jin was becoming increasingly strict with them. That's when some of them noticed that our protagonist had returned and asked if he was feeling better. The boy replied that he was, but the girl who had asked that question became curious, sensing there was something different about him. That's when someone else approached our boy, saying that he had finally returned. It was Mu Jin, who hadn't been able to speak with him properly earlier because he was in the middle of training. Our boy signaled that he understood the reason, saying that it must be very difficult to lead something that he should have been doing himself. But even as he said that, he was wondering why he didn't descend the stairs. Mu Jin said he was grateful for having had the opportunity, but our boy replied that from now on he would take it from here. That placed a hint of anger in Mu Jin's eyes. The students hadn't even left the place yet and overheard everything. The one who had gone to fetch our protagonist from the room realized he wasn't mistaken. That young man had truly changed. Mu Jin said it was the protagonist himself who had entrusted him with the task. That was when our boy asked if there was anything wrong with him taking back his own responsibilities. Mu Jin replied that this only happened because the boy hadn't been confident enough. Now with a smirk on his face, our protagonist knew exactly what was happening. That idiot standing before him was planning to become the head disciple. That position would one day allow him to become the sect leader's successor. And due to the massacre, there were few first-generation disciples left in that place, and both they and the elders were too busy rebuilding what had been destroyed. Our boy knew that if he wanted to change that sect, it would be easier to start with the second-generation disciples, not to mention the purple aura circulation technique. Only the sect leader and the head disciple could learn this technique. It was one of the 10 most powerful techniques when it came to internal energy circulation, and he needed it to become stronger than his past self. That's why he needed the position of head disciple, and he knew the next words would be shocking to Mujin. But Mujin had a question of his own, asking if our boy even had the right to do that. He asked what he had done during the invasion by the Black Knights. The elders had told him not to engage in combat, but he ignored their advice, and something happened because of it. He didn't save anyone. He didn't defeat any enemies. All he managed to do was become a burden to the elders. And because of what he did, many other disciples followed his lead. If the first-generation disciples hadn't risked themselves to protect them, many people wouldn't be there now. Our protagonist agreed with every word, which only made Mujin even more upset. And our boy said he intended to take on the responsibilities of head disciple, but Mujin said they couldn't trust him. Approaching him, our protagonist said that the boy was misunderstanding a few things. Mujin started thinking while our boy drew closer and closer until he asked what he had misunderstood. And in a threatening tone, our boy asked since when did he have to look up to see Mujin, and he asked if it looked like he was trying to convince him or if he needed permission to declare the choices he had made. After all, he wasn't making a request. He was notifying that disciple. That was when Mujin realized something was wrong. That man in front of him wasn't the same senior disciple he had once known. Our boy said that he would be responsible for the next day's training, and if Mujin had any complaints, he should bring them up after the session. And as he walked away, he told the boy not to get all worked up. Mujin commented that the senior seemed like a completely different person. Our boy said that people change after seeing death, and maybe that's what happened to him. The other students started talking about what had just happened. No one could understand the change, and they wanted to know if the senior disciple was really going to lead training the next day. Some of them went to Murian, bringing the news that the senior disciple would be leading the session. They thought it was strange. First he seemed annoyed, then very calm, and they hadn't heard the full conversation. One of them was worried, knowing how skilled our boy really was, and the girl asked what would happen if they did the same thing. Her peer didn't understand, so she decided to explain. They should try talking to him. It was already nighttime, and our protagonist was meditating. That was when he heard voices outside his room. The voice said he wasn't asleep yet and had come by to talk, and that the topic should be discussed without others present. Grabbing his sword, our boy said he was very curious about the subject. Those who came to talk to our protagonist were now very surprised. Outside his room, they noticed the boy had come out carrying a wooden sword. They knew that wasn't like him at all, and the girl got straight to the point. She wanted him to reconsider his decision as she believed Mujin had avoided continuing the argument to preserve his image. Our boy asked if they were sent there by that guy, but the students assured him they came of their own will. Our protagonist said it wasn't their place to decide that and that he would pretend he hadn't heard anything. But the girl insisted. She wanted them to consider the student's perspective. They weren't doing this because they disliked him, but because they wanted to learn from someone who actually knew something. Saying that our protagonist should self-reflect, he didn't have what it takes and was being selfish. They didn't want a leader who was beneath them. Those were insolent words, and our boy didn't like it, stating that the hierarchy of that sect seemed to have degraded quite a bit. He acknowledged the students' words, and since they doubted his abilities, he decided to show a little of them, ordering them to grab their swords. The students thought he was joking, but our boy knew exactly how they were feeling. According to the order, the student said he had asked for it. The girl was the first to move toward him, saying he would soon regret what he had asked for. But before she could strike, she was immediately disarmed by our boy. As if that wasn't enough, she took a hit to the chest that knocked the wind out of her, all just to teach them a few things. The other student decided it was time to attack too, but with him, our protagonist was less merciful, hitting him square in the face with the wooden sword. Now the two who had been proud and defiant were lying on the ground, completely defeated. The girl couldn't even properly say she had lost, and our protagonist responded that the outcome had been obvious, and he would take the opportunity to teach them both an important lesson. That's when the girl realized her troubles were just beginning. After putting the students through some physical punishment and giving them a free face massage, our protagonist asked if they were satisfied with their skills. They said yes. He also asked if they knew what would happen if other students ganged up to fight him. Both replied in unison that they'd get beaten along with them. He asked if they thought he was weaker than Mujin. They said no, that he was much stronger. He asked if they still thought he was weaker than the other disciples. They both answered no. Now it seemed they had learned their lesson. Our boy said he would forget what had happened that night because everyone can make mistakes. Morning training time was coming soon, so the two of them needed to get some rest. The students thanked the senior disciple for his mercy, leaving the area with great difficulty, all while our protagonist silently watched. He knew he was being watched and asked how long that person planned to keep hiding. Revealing himself, the boy asked how he knew he was being watched, and our protagonist said he was too big to hide. Muchiel said he saw other disciples heading to our protagonist's room and ended up following them just in case. He hadn't imagined our protagonist would be able to defeat them. Then the boy asked if our protagonist had been hiding his power all this time. For a brief moment, he began to think. He realized that second-generation disciples could be divided into two types: those who stayed distant from Mu Hui, but maintained a certain level of respect, and those who despised him and spoke badly about him behind his back. Muchiel didn't fit into either of those groups. In fact, he constantly helped Manhwa, but our protagonist didn't know why he did such a thing. Maybe it was because he was a bit older, our protagonist thought he knew the real reason. It might just be that he was worried, since the old Manhwa was very weak, so weak that he needed help from others. Muchiel probably thought our protagonist could get seriously hurt in that situation, so he followed those other students to make sure nothing would happen, and it certainly wasn't the first time he did it. Our boy planned to give him a plausible explanation for his power. He said he hadn't been hiding it, he had simply reached a new level. Those words left his peer quite thoughtful. While our protagonist promised to talk more about it during morning training, and since it was already late, they needed to rest, Muchiel simply watched our boy return to his room, trying to understand what he meant by reaching a new level, because he had seen the protagonist use a basic sword technique. But something else surprised him greatly. That was the most beautiful execution he had ever seen in his entire life, and he began to wonder what was different about his friend. He had always thought he was extremely weak, but something had changed, enough to make him excited for training, and our boy realized he needed to give a proper explanation once it started. Inside the disciples' dormitory, another student wasn't happy, because he had heard that his peers had been beaten up, that it wasn't the senior they used to know, but a completely different person. They were telling Maria and they had really taken a beating, but the disciples said they were talking nonsense and should just go to sleep. As they left completely bruised, they started to regret not believing what they were told, hoping that Murian would find out the hard way they were telling the truth. That's when Mujin saw those battered disciples walking down the hallway and became very curious. He immediately asked what happened, since they were limping and looked terrible. The other disciple said it was nothing. They just hadn't liked the news that the senior disciple would be leading morning training. After a brief chat, he explained everything to Mujin, and he said he would have to discipline those two later, which surprised that disciple. Even though the senior disciple was staking his claim, he would soon realize that role didn't belong to him, and they shouldn't have done it behind Mujin's back. He felt very ashamed, and the disciple tried to say they were just concerned, but Mujin ignored those words. He said he would take care of it, but it wasn't the younger disciple's place to interfere, leaving the boy quiet and embarrassed. The next day, everyone had gathered for morning training, which was immediately confirmed by our protagonist. He said he wanted to say a few words before training began, and people started wondering how someone could change so much from one day to the next. Maybe he had been hiding his abilities. Mujin was impressed he had managed to beat those two students. He started to think maybe Muchiel had helped him, which would have been plausible, but he would soon learn the full truth. Through that training, he'd find out whether it was just a bluff, and our boy got straight to the point, saying that they were all weak. Even though there are many reasons someone becomes strong, there's only one reason for weakness: neglecting the basics. And because of that, they would only train the 6-strike sword technique that morning, the basic technique. He believed everyone wanted to learn it properly first, so they could move on to more complex techniques. After saying that, our boy began observing the students. Many were silent and some deep in thought, until one of them asked if there was anything wrong with wanting to learn things quickly, while thinking that if his peers hadn't been able to expose this farce, he would be the one to do it, and his classmates who had been beaten the night before realized that if things kept going this way, they'd be beaten again. The boy kept saying some arrogant things. That's when our protagonist called Murian to come speak with him directly. It didn't take long before several students were completely surprised. Even Mujin hadn't expected something like that, and he began to wonder what our protagonist was planning to do. Poor Murian walked toward our protagonist with a lot of confidence. He said he knew what was going to happen, but wasn't sure it was a good idea to leave training under our protagonist's leadership, and that the basic technique wasn't as important as he was claiming, and everyone knew his technique was awful. It was our protagonist who said the last word, as if he had guessed what the boy was about to say, believing that the boy had come to challenge him in front of everyone. Our protagonist already knew he wouldn't be easily accepted, so he asked everyone to pay attention. He said he wouldn't take a single step from his position, and would use that basic technique to block Murian's attacks, leaving the students stunned. And our protagonist guaranteed that if he were touched by Murian's sword or took even one step, he'd lose that duel. If Murian won, he wouldn't teach the 6-strike technique. And that wasn't all. He guaranteed he wouldn't be in charge of morning training. That made Mujin pay close attention. The arrogant student thought our protagonist was being too full of himself just because he beat up those two, and our boy confirmed they were indeed badly hurt in that fight. Murian only told our protagonist not to hate him after losing in front of all the disciples, while our boy hoped the idiot wouldn't cross that line. It didn't take long for their duel to begin, and our boy was able to hold his ground confidently, blocking every sword strike with great mastery. No matter where the attacks came from, he blocked them all. And the students were becoming increasingly impressed, since Murian was only increasing the speed and intensity of his attacks. He started delivering a massive barrage of strikes. One of the girls realized that was the wind-focused sword. That technique was known for its speed, and among second-generation disciples, Murian was the one who performed it best. Keel also knew the boy had improved, but it didn't seem to be enough. Because our protagonist blocked all of those attacks with ease, our boy admitted that he needed to use more strength to deal with that guy than the others he had fought. In other words, he said the kid was less terrible than the rest. Then he asked if that was all he had to show. Rian started feeling frustrated, but the truth was, he didn't master any other technique as well as this one, and he began to wonder what he could do during the match. The disciples knew Rian was very good, but the senior was really better. They no longer knew what had happened to him, since he wasn't fazed by any of those blows. Mujin was also at a complete loss for words, watching that duel, trying to understand how this had happened. Because nothing Ryan had tried had worked, he reached a point where he didn't know what to do and began wondering when the senior had improved so much. Our boy told him the answer wasn't strength. The sword must be swung with the whole body, and the most important part of this stage was the feet, because that's where movement begins. Without mastering that, the sword becomes useless. Our boy said he wasn't even fully healed yet and still blocked all those attacks. That's why Rian's technique was terrible. Then he asked if Rian could now understand why they had to start with the basics. Rian, fully defeated, realized that the basics were important. But our protagonist thought he hadn't truly grasped that yet, saying he would now show him what it meant to move a sword using the entire body. Rian tried to correct himself, saying he hadn't meant anything against him. And the poor disciples watched in great fear. They had to take that student to the infirmary. While some ran to help him, others were completely stunned. And our protagonist asked what they were doing just standing there. They should be raising their swords now. If they didn't, he would take it as them questioning his methods, and they could fight him to express their dissatisfaction. Seeing that they were all raising their swords, our boy realized they had accepted his teachings. Finally, he could begin training them. The training session began, and there was a bit of blood on our protagonist's face, but it wasn't his. Our boy began correcting each of his new students, teaching each of them the basics. And he began to remember his past life when his friend was talking about Manhwa, his disciple, who didn't have any remarkable qualities. The long-haired man admitted the boy was quite ordinary, but there was something else about him. He had never seen the boy give up on anything in life. And our protagonist asked if he had chosen the boy solely because of his determination. The long-haired man said other disciples found enlightenment through their own paths, but that wasn't the case with Manhwa. To turn an ordinary person into a martial artist, a mentor is needed. That task was his. And our protagonist acknowledged that it would be great to have only talented people as students, but he was no longer the ghost swordsman. He was the senior disciple, someone responsible for teaching the younger ones the principles of the sect. He wouldn't leave anyone behind. They would all remain together until the end. But he realized that in his past life he wasn't a good teacher, and now he had a big class. Having disciples was more annoying than he had imagined, and he thought that if he met his friend in the afterlife, he'd make him pay with a really good drink. That's when he asked if Mujin was already tired, telling him he should try harder. Somewhere deep in a forest, someone wondered how the boy was doing, since he had focused on making him tougher, not turning him into a teacher. But one thing was certain, the boy wasn't losing fights and must be doing well. Leaving a trail of defeated enemies behind, he admitted it would be great to meet him again. Now one of those disciples was panting heavily. They were all going through very harsh training, carrying weights as they exercised. Certainly, this would be a hard road for them, as they had to start from scratch. Our protagonist was sure they would blossom after this challenge, and their brilliance would be deep and strong, unable to be contained. Besides that, our protagonist also had a long road ahead. Amid those trees full of blossoms, he walked through the crimson forest. Those were the first steps he took to change the path and eventually create his own martial domain. One of the most important things about this was to refine his own senses. The sharper they became, the easier it would be to detect small changes. This happened naturally while training martial arts. He hadn't felt that when he first opened his eyes in this new body, but now he was able to perceive things, realizing that someone was watching him. At the moment, it didn't feel hostile. It seemed the person watching was doing so out of curiosity, and our protagonist couldn't yet tell who it was. But eventually, he would know who was observing him so skillfully. He was heading to a building inside the sect. Inside was Hyungak, who was surprised by the visit. As soon as he welcomed Manhwa, our boy greeted him formally. The man asked if he needed anything, and our boy revealed he wanted to learn the secret techniques. The man thought to himself how surprising that was and seemed to agree with the request. He said his wounds hadn't healed yet, so he should be careful, and our boy confirmed that he would be cautious. That man had also heard that his disciple had been rude to our protagonist, but our boy had no idea who it could be. He still didn't know everyone's names. What he did know was that he had thoroughly beaten those 3 clowns, and in the end it didn't matter who that disciple was. Still, he began to think the man might be angry about it, and to his surprise, the man apologized for what happened, saying that Musain did something he shouldn't have done, and if it had been back in his day, the consequences would have been far worse, and he apologized for not raising the boy properly. Now our protagonist knew who it was and was still surprised that his actions hadn't caused a much bigger problem. He told the man that he simply did what his senior disciple should have done, so there was no need to worry, which caught the man off guard. He began looking at our boy with wide eyes, impressed by the sense of responsibility he had taken on as senior disciple, until he noticed something different about him. Mui's eyes were different. He hadn't known the boy had such a deep gaze. Our boy felt like he was being watched and began to wonder if the man had changed his mind and might try some kind of retaliation. But the truth was, the man had simply noticed the determination in his eyes, saying it was a good thing that he was taking care of the younger disciples, and he had no intention of stopping him, telling him he could go on his way. Watching him leave, he remembered that the boy's master had died, and he had been left alone, and now, despite all that hardship, he was determined, and the man felt proud of the young man who was pulling himself together with dignity. Now that he had access to the secret techniques, our boy began to study them diligently. He was about to take the first step toward building his own martial domain. He might start with strength, but he knew that was the wrong answer. Life and death weren't decided by strength alone. No one fights recklessly when their life is on the line in Jianghu. The most important thing is to survive, and for that, one must use their techniques with precision and efficiency, having great reasoning skills and a body that can keep up with the mind. To form a martial domain, one must master their techniques. Experience and wisdom come with the process. The mind must be focused through endless contemplation and reflection. That was the definition of a martial domain he had discovered in his past life. That's how the sword ghost lived, developing his own secret techniques. And contemplating the first step that must be taken is to truly understand what martial arts are. That's why he needs to know the secret of Manhwa and its true meaning. He doesn't have that answer yet. There is knowledge he still cannot access. Disciples can't have access to everything, so they don't become greedy or foolishly try to leap beyond their limits. All sects restrict access to knowledge, and this sect is no different. Our boy had heard from Hyunjo that the sect was on the losing side, but a renowned sect will always be renowned. Their martial artists are very systematic, so the notes are not hard to understand. That most basic technique, the 6-strike combo, once learned, allowed our boy to master 3 other techniques: the focused wind, the fallen plum blossom, and the 1,000-fragrance sword. After learning the basics of these techniques, he could finally reach the secrets of the plum blossom sword. Only then would he reach the true secrets: the 7 deadly petals, the triple-edged petal, and the lucid petal sword. The strength of the sect lies in these techniques. The best of Mount Huo learn more than one of these techniques. The 6-strike technique is the beginning of everything, followed by the plum blossom and others. A martial artist who perfects this sect's doctrine becomes part of the plum tree itself. That summarizes everything he understood so far. He had just reached the shallowest branch, and he deeply wanted to climb to the higher ones. But first he had to master the plum blossom sword, a weapon given only to those who earn recognition from their masters. It is a symbol of the sect. Our boy realized he needed to reach it as soon as possible. That's when one of the masters noticed he was studying the secrets of the plum blossom sword. It was the sect leader himself. He had come to see who was in that place, since it wasn't usually visited, and he was surprised to see our boy there so late. He asked if he could sit beside him. Our boy said he had no objections, and the full moon shone in the sky. Our boy hadn't noticed how quickly time had passed. Certainly, Hyun Gak had kindly lit the candles for him. With one of the books in hand, the master asked if the boy had read it all, and the boy said yes. The master had heard he had resumed teaching the 6-strike technique to the 2nd-generation disciples, and also that he was in charge of morning training. The master decided to ask why he wanted to teach that technique, while our boy wondered about the reason for such questioning. The truth is, the master was curious. Mugwai always hesitated to answer him even when the questions were simple. Besides having changed, the boy was now doing things he had never done before. There was concern in his thoughts, since the boy had lost his master. Our boy figured that was probably the reason too. The master only hoped that he wasn't pretending to be better, and our protagonist managed to sense that he was being tested. He decided he would give the answers the master wanted, telling him that the foundation of the sect was that 6-strike combination, and the man agreed. Continuing his explanation, he said that the 2nd-generation disciples had started the wrong way, which left the master impressed. But the boy was even harsher with his words, saying that maybe those disciples hadn't even truly started learning. And the master was genuinely surprised. Our boy imagined that the master must already know that the 2nd generation was indeed very poor, and by telling him what he really thought, they would likely end up agreeing. But the master realized that Mui's condition was even worse than he had imagined. Now the two were looking at each other, both deep in thought. The sect master is wondering if the boy standing in front of him is the same one he once knew. At first, he was a very innocent boy, someone who would never do anything bad to anyone. It's truly interesting that he ended up like this. It may be that the attack caused by the Black Knights has led to this, and the boy might be cultivating a deep resentment. Perhaps he is still punishing himself for what happened. The master thought he should tell him that the boy is not to blame, but as he continued his speech, our protagonist said that they all already know. That sentence took the master by surprise. Mui continued his reasoning, saying that all the 2nd-generation disciples already know the 6 strikes technique, since it is the first step for all the others. The problem is that in their current state, their technique has worsened considerably. The master understood what the boy meant. It seems the disciples are regressing, and he asked what the reason for that might be. The sects and clans that exist in Jianghu have different ideologies, and those end up merging with their martial arts, which are an expression of their ideas. Like the Teiji Fist sect and their enlightenment for the art of the sword, or the sun-crushing sword sect. These are some examples of what he was talking about. It's not enough to merely train the disciple's body, it's necessary to explore and understand the ideology of one's own clan. The master noticed that our protagonist was explaining all of this very calmly, being extremely precise with his words. In some way, he couldn't explain that boy made him think of Kimjo, and our protagonist continued explaining, the disciples are skipping steps. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's definitely not wise. After hearing all that, the master asked what he was proposing, and our boy said that he needs to help them realize that learning the clan's special technique is not the focus of martial arts. They need to train hard and apply that to their daily lives. That is the true essence of that school. For the plum blossom is not the end of all things. The master was surprised to hear those words, It was as if he were speaking with Hyunjo himself. Although they are nothing alike, he could feel the presence of the master within that disciple, who was shining just as Hyunjo did in the past. He began to wonder if he was the only one who saw the true talent in that child. The master revealed that the plum blossom technique comes naturally through training, and that the boy thinks deeply despite his young age. He had made an excellent observation. Now he wanted to know what our protagonist would do, and the boy said he intends to guide the disciples in their training so they can master the 6 strikes technique. But that wasn't what the master wanted to know. He knew our protagonist would do that flawlessly. He wanted to know what path the young man would follow. So he began to think about it and about things from his past life. After studying the techniques of that sect, he realized that all of them are of great quality. But he also found things that are somewhat frustrating, and he is someone who prioritizes efficiency in order to survive. He questioned the small size of the swords or the techniques that ignored weapons entirely. This led him to many different thoughts, thinking that combat tactics were lacking. It could be that his path will differ from that of the sect, until he reached a point where he couldn't hold it in anymore. Remembering his friend, he said he might go against the principles of that sect and hoped he wouldn't be upset. With his answer ready, he told the master that he wasn't thinking of anything too grand. He wishes to do things as his own master once desired, filling the position he left in that place. He wants to surpass his master's achievements, for that is the true duty of a disciple. But the truth is, our boy will do whatever he wants. Yet his words were convincing to the master, who was deeply impressed after hearing them, understanding why he sees Hyunjo in that boy. It's not a matter of talent. He truly inherited his master's will. This path will be very difficult, as creating a new martial art is no easy task. But with that brief conversation, the master was sure of one thing: the boy will succeed. Laughing heartily, he said he was proud of him, and he was certain that wherever Hyunjo might be, he too would be proud of his disciple. That master had been very worried about this boy, but after that conversation, he began to feel great hope sparked by the determination in his eyes. The fragrance of the plum blossom will be far stronger in the future. He had not been able to protect the young buds during the attack. He should have been the flower to fall from the tree. Even after that attack, there are still small peels with great potential, and the master's task is to contribute to that. And he told our protagonist that there are many other flowers on that mountain. Then he decided to ask our boy if he knows why that clan chose the plum blossom, and the master said the boy would learn a great deal if he began to reflect on that. Rising from the table, he revealed that he would like to speak further with that disciple, but he believed he had already taken too much of his time. Thus, he began to leave that room. Before he could go, he said he was forgetting something he wanted to tell him. The master was once a disciple himself and lost his own master. He cannot fully understand the boy's sorrow, even if it is similar, because people feel things in different ways. But life and death are part of life. It is the natural flow of things. He advised our protagonist not to dwell on grief, but to see it as a new beginning and try to understand it as a way to celebrate life. Our boy realized that this was excellent advice. Trying to celebrate life is not bad at all. So he thanked the master for sharing his wisdom with him. Thinking about the plum blossom, he began to remember his past life, when one of his seniors said that our protagonist's body was far too fragile. He would not tolerate that kind of insult, and the senior replied that he was arrogant, an excellent quality for someone who wants to grow stronger. He shared with our boy that he had discovered a new way to train and asked if he would like to test it. The next day, our protagonist was hanging from a tree while carrying weights with his legs. The less conditioned the body, the more effective that training method is. He never imagined that Crazy Senior could be useful one day. That way of training is brutal, but it works. While he was focused on his training, another disciple appeared. Bringing him news, he said it was not the time to be training, because a very important time had arrived, but our boy had no idea what it could be. And that girl said that the leader of the sect assigned our boy a journey down to the foot of the mountain. The clan leadership was gathered in a room, discussing the situation of the third-generation students. They needed to open this class soon, but everything became difficult after the massacre. One of them suggested accepting disciples from other sects, to show the community that they were doing well, and the master agreed with that. One of them said they should also send a disciple to an outer sect in Shaanxi. He was certain that the Unorthodox Alliance or some other evil organization was trying to fill the power vacuum left in that place. Outer sects are those that are not on that mountain, and they depend on the main sects for recognition. Because of the heavy blow they suffered, the outer sects connected to them must be very anxious and worried. The master thought of sending a disciple to see how things were on the outside, and then they began to think about who could be sent. But for him, the answer was obvious. They were so busy they couldn't waste time on this kind of matter, so this issue needed to be resolved immediately. He shared with all the leaders that he would like to send a second-year student for this task. Some of the masters there were concerned because the outside of the mountain could be a complete mess. Someone suggested they should take more than one talented student for this, and one of the leaders asked if the master was referring to the 3 flowers. And that same man said they should send Mugwai as well, since that wouldn't be a problem. But as soon as our protagonist's name was mentioned, a great silence filled that meeting room. The elder who had treated his wounds was worried, but the master assured them that the boy had recovered in the past month. He was certain that he would be perfectly fine. The meeting continued with the leadership, and now we are in the city of Posen. Our boy went there with 3 other companions, and he was impressed with that city. That place was small and not particularly notable, but he was sure they must sell some strong drinks there. That was when his friend was impressed by something and asked him to see it too. It was a recipe made with chicken, She never imagined that this could become such a tasty ingredient that was very different from what they ate back on the mountain. Distracted by the food, another colleague asked Manhwa to keep her composure. She said she would, but she kept getting distracted by the smell of the food in that place. It seems our protagonist found something interesting, and Manhwa kept completely distracted, seeing all that variety of food, until someone bumped into her shoulder as she wasn't looking forward. Very surprised by what had happened, she decided to look back, realizing that the man did not look friendly. The students were being watched by some locals. One of them was about to make that man apologize, but our protagonist interrupted him. That man noticed by their uniforms that they must be second-year students, and this was certainly their first time in the city. That man did not like having bumped into the girl, and he asked if they didn't teach basic manners in that place. She said she was not responsible for what happened, and our boy realized that, judging by those people's clothes, they must be connected to some sort of criminal organization. Maybe they were already trying to seize power in that place, since after the massacre everything fell into chaos. Even so, it was quite bold to try to confront those students. For this to be happening, they were certainly being influenced by someone more powerful. But that didn't matter. Our boy didn't think this was a problem. They needed to learn how to deal with troublesome people, and this was a great opportunity to do so. While the girl was talking, one of the men began staring intently at her body. Without him noticing, a sword approached his face. It was millimeters away from piercing his eye. That was when our protagonist asked that man where he was looking. Everyone was very surprised by that hostile gesture, and our boy said he had known from the start that they were the ones who bumped into her. He wanted to see how they would act in that situation, as this was their first time in the city, but that man had gone too far. And now he had started a fight with the entire Manhwa sect. Now he understood how the underworld of that city saw his clan, which surprised that thug as they had been exposed, and he thought he should do something about it. Becoming far more polite, he began to apologize, but our boy said he would not accept words from a worm like him. So if he didn't want the other fool to lose his eye, he should shut his mouth and get out of there. And from the look in our protagonist's eyes, that thug realized this was no bluff. It didn't take long for them to start running desperately, because if they stayed, it would be very dangerous. The girl apologized to our protagonist for what happened, but he assured her that she was the victim and didn't need to do that. Knowing that everyone must be shaken by what happened, he suggested they should find a place to rest a bit and eat. The girl, who was already very hungry, liked the suggestion, and they all began chatting casually. The other talented boy in the group was reflecting. His action had been very different from our protagonists. Even without knowing what had happened, he had tried to suggest that Manhwa apologize, because all he was thinking about was ending things cautiously, and he forgot that they should also know how to stand up to those thugs who despised the sect. And he realized that our protagonist understood what was happening, being fully aware of what was going on around him at all times. But the truth is, our boy already regretted not having driven his sword into that man, and the talented boy realized that he needed to keep pushing himself, so things like that wouldn't happen again, because he didn't want his companions to be disrespected by anyone. As soon as they found a place to eat, this boy tried to pay attention to what was happening around him, but when he did, he ended up with a not-so-friendly expression. After some time, they all managed to eat plenty, and they were satisfied. Our protagonist became concerned about his companions, noticing that they were eating less. This could be a sign they weren't training much, but they assured him that wasn't the case. Manhwa wanted to know what they should do now. It would have been much easier if the clan master had revealed their mission, but his orders had been very vague. Our boy asked if anything noteworthy had happened that day, and she remembered that someone had tried to cause trouble with them. Then they rented some rooms and had that meal. Then she remembered the city's underworld, and that the master had given them authority to make their own decisions. And our protagonist didn't have much patience. He wanted to teach those thugs a lesson, sending them on a one-way trip to find out if God exists. Night finally fell over the city. After a long deliberation, our boy wanted to know what Mujin thought of his idea. He believed they should gather more information before starting to act. Then our boy asked what the others thought of that. Everyone agreed that gathering information was a good idea, and our protagonist's team is carefully observing those people, because our boy ordered them to gather as much information as possible before the next day's sunset. Two men approach a woman. They seem to be harassing her. These are the criminals from that city's underworld. People from the underworld are quite different from those who belong to unorthodox sects and from demonic forces. And that thug told the woman that the calculations were done and that the interest rate had increased greatly. He had forgotten to mention that, and the woman seemed not to understand. The bald man said they needed to collect the money now, and it was his fault for not having mentioned it before, but if she didn't have the money right now, she could pay in another way. These bandits only seek to ruin people's lives, exploiting the weak. Assassins are also part of this, since they only do their jobs for money. The difference is they do only that. For ordinary people, underworld thugs are truly dangerous, since they seek only personal satisfaction. Our boy was still impressed with what had happened earlier, and approaching those thugs, he said he couldn't understand that. That was when they noticed the boy was approaching. Not knowing who our boy was, one of them began complaining loudly, because he had ordered his partner to watch the place. Little did they know that this poor soul was already on a one-way trip to feed the worms. Our boy asked who they thought they were to behave like that, and if they had someone protecting them from retaliation. Unwilling to give him the answer he wanted, the bandits asked if the boy wanted to start a fight, because if he didn't want to be destroyed in that place, he should leave as quickly as possible. Our boy lowered his hood over his face, saying that he had come there to gather information. But the bandits kept ignoring him, and one of them went back to what he was doing, until our protagonist surprised one of those fools by introducing him to his right knee. The poor guy's body flew several meters. It was so sudden that the bald man was left speechless, wondering what our protagonist was doing. The answer came in the form of another strike. After jumping, our boy landed on the ground with the sole of his foot on that poor guy's face, who now had lost consciousness. At that moment, the bald man realized his situation was getting complicated, and the woman tried to run away from him. That was when our protagonist drew the bald man's attention, and using all of his accumulated common sense, he decided to obey. Imagining that the bald man might know some martial arts, he told him to try attacking with killing intent. Only then could he spare this incompetent man's life. As if that weren't enough, he also demanded that he hand over everything in his wallet. Elsewhere in that same city, a drunkard was suffering the effects of alcohol-induced dehydration. At a table near him, his companions asked if all he did was piss all day long. If he kept taking so long, they'd soon be sober. As soon as he finished his business, the old man said he'd be back. As he walked back toward his companions, he didn't notice that there were some people tied to that tree. When he arrived at the table, they resumed talking. It seemed one of them wanted to show something funny he had found. It looked like someone at the table next to them had ordered a huge amount of food, but then left right away. Inside the city, Manhwa was talking with people to gather information. Sheol, on the other hand, was spying on suspicious-looking people. All the disciples seemed very dedicated to the task assigned by our protagonist, and on the outskirts of the city, some wrongdoers were gathering. One of them complained that the place smelled like food. They took that as an offense, not knowing where that person might have gone, that they could no longer hold back. As they began to approach that hooded man, they decided they would take all the food he had. But that mysterious presence revealed that he was not defenseless, for he was carrying a very sharp sword. Looking at those wretches, this man said he was not there to share his food, and if they tried to take it, he would cut off their heads. That was when the leader of those people decided to introduce himself, saying that the young master was truly oppressive. He began to apologize on behalf of all of them and said his name was Jinga, leader of the beggars sect. Sheathing his sword, our protagonist also introduced himself formally. He was Muhui of the Dumont Mount Hua sect. The leader of the beggars said he also lamented what had happened in the massacre and regretted that he could not help. Our boy said it was all right because that had been bad for everyone. Now that they had introduced themselves, the beggar leader wanted to know what that boy was doing in his territory, and our protagonist said he had come to gather information. Assuring them that the food wouldn't taste as good if it got cold, he said that was why they needed to eat while they talked. It didn't take long before they were savoring what our boy had brought. He soon discovered that those bandits belonged to Brutal Blood, a faction that had tried to seize power in that city due to the imbalance caused by the massacre. The beggar said everyone in that faction used martial arts. Our protagonist knew that because he had dealt with some of them. But he still hadn't addressed the most important thing, which made the beggar leader curious. Our boy wanted to know who was behind that Brutal Blood faction. That left the beggar leader quite surprised because the boy was assuming there must be a thinking head behind those brutes. And our protagonist said that region wasn't small and their sect was fairly large, and even so, their power had already been taken. Because of all those factors, it was very unlikely that a small organization could take control so quickly. What usually happens in a scenario like that is several small organizations start fighting for power, splitting that entire region, and the beggar was impressed with our boy's discernment. It was hard to believe he was just a rising talent, revealing that he hadn't told this to a boy yet, not because he wanted to hide the truth, but because he wasn't sure about it. He told him not to be surprised, but there's a martial artist who always contacts the Brutal Blood faction, and they belong to the Guryu Sword sect. That put our boy on alert, for that is one of the 3 great sects of the Shaanxi region. It is also close to the 2 largest among the 10 sects, but they had never cared about Mount Hua or the Zhongnan sect, and numerically, they were far more numerous. But it was still looking very suspicious. It did make sense for Gyu to hide their ambitions. Perhaps they couldn't even focus on a region like that. And the beggar leader stressed that he couldn't say for sure that the mastermind behind all of this was someone from the Gyu sect. And before he finished, our boy said they wouldn't care about appearances. Besides, there was no concrete evidence about this, so they already had doubts about that sect's involvement. Looking at the beggar leader, he said he'd like to know who that martial artist was, and the beggar realized he hadn't shared that information. He believed it was the Red Wolf Sword. Our boy seemed to recognize that name, asking if it was really him, and after confirming the information, the beggar leader noticed that the boy had already heard that name. Even without knowing what he planned to do, he recommended that he be very cautious. While reflecting on that name, our boy began to wonder who that martial artist could be, because the truth is, he had never heard that name in his entire life. Morning dawned over that city, and our boy was looking out the window. He was thinking about everything they had done the day before. Although he had managed to gather some information, he still couldn't say who the Red Sword Wolf was. He'd also remembered that the night before he had tried to drink a little alcohol, because that beggar had been serving tea. As soon as he asked for some, he was given the water that birds don't drink, hoping that with that he could get more information. He only wanted to drink a little to follow through with his plan. The problem was that he stumbled on a variable he hadn't considered. The taste of that wine was simply exceptional. Even the beggar chief noticed that the boy had enjoyed it. Our protagonist said it had been a long time since he had tasted something so interesting, which made the beggar believe that it was his first time. That marked the end of his investigation. He dedicated himself to drinking as he hadn't expected to find something so delicious. That is why he didn't get the information he wanted. Even so, he already had enough to form some suspicions. Now it remained to see what choices his team would make. Since there was still plenty of time that day, he decided to amuse himself with the wine that was left. As soon as his team arrived at that place, everyone had the same thought. It smelled like alcohol in there. Then our boy asked them to pay attention, because he wanted to know everything they had discovered in that city. Before giving the information, the girl said he shouldn't be drinking while they were working. Our boy was categorical in saying he hadn't done that, but he didn't seem convincing. Changing the subject, he said he wanted to know what they had discovered. One of them found out that the criminal underworld now dominated that city. Because of the massacre, they used that opportunity to take control. The girl said they were all bastards who oppressed the poor in that place, stealing money and committing other crimes, abusing violence at every opportunity. Keel continued. The biggest problem was that they were martial artists. Even if low-level ones, it was still very dangerous for those who couldn't defend themselves. Our protagonist liked what they had done, emphasizing that even though time was short, they had worked very well. Now he would share what he had discovered. Everything they had said was true. Later, he also confirmed this information, but there was something they needed to pay attention to. How had those bandits learned martial arts? Third-level techniques are not hard to learn, and it's easy to get books that teach those techniques. But those bandits were not the kind of people who would ever touch a book in their lives. Some even use books as firewood. So it is entirely possible that someone is helping those bandits. Our boy decided to look for who that person was. He managed to discover a pseudonym, but he didn't know their true identity. His companions wanted to know who it was, and our boy shared the name he had heard, the Red Sword Wolf, who belongs to the Nine Hells sect. As soon as they heard this, one of his companions realized they were dealing with criminals who were a bit more dangerous. Our protagonist wanted to ambush and finish them all off, but for that, he needed his team's opinion. Some were hesitant, since those criminals were associated with a dangerous sect. Kievel said he didn't know why they were collaborating, the bandits and the sect, and because of the danger, he thought they shouldn't decide on their own. It would be better to tell the elders. And our protagonist wanted to know if he truly believed that. The girl said she agreed with our protagonist. They couldn't ignore all that injustice. They needed to do something for the people of that city. Munji started to get worried because he wanted to avoid greater danger. He thought they should consider the situation. They were already recovering from that brutal massacre, and facing another sect because of those problems could be disastrous. So he told our protagonist that he considered that approach very dangerous. If they were only dealing with bandits, it would be a matter of minutes. But if the Nine Hells sect was behind it, he feared it could start a war. Our protagonist understood his concern but thought he was exaggerating. A war would not happen. Munji wanted to know how our boy could be so sure about that, and he said that wasn't the Nine Hells way of operating. They are a very tyrannical organization. If they wanted to eliminate someone, it would simply start a war. They wouldn't act in the shadows as they were doing now. Not to mention that Mount Hua was already very fragile. They could be invaded and destroyed at any moment. The truth is that most likely the Nine Hells don't have the time or resources to care about them right now. Very possibly the bandits were not even associated with that sect, and even if they were, a war was unlikely. He hoped Mujin understood, but the boy only had more questions. He asked where our protagonist had gotten all this information and whether it was truly reliable. Our boy said he had learned all of it through the beggar's sect. That left Mujin very surprised. He knew that was an orthodox sect made up of those relatives who lived on the streets. They were also the most numerous in all of Murim, using their numerical advantage to gather information, earning food and money in the process. Despite being poor, they knew martial arts and followed their own ethics and moral order. Of one thing he was sure: any information that came from those beggars was absolutely trustworthy. Mujin recalled some words he had heard from our protagonist, who promised he would try to solve this peacefully before resorting to a violent solution. Realizing he was worrying too much about that matter, he decided he would calm down. While they were discussing, our boy warned everyone they had arrived. Before they could react, our protagonist broke the wooden gate in front of them. Watching all that unfold, Mujin realized that peace was not an option. And inside, the men in that place were shocked and frightened because someone had destroyed the gate. Asking who those intruders were, our protagonist said it was very good that everyone was gathered there, and they should send a message to the Red Sword Wolf and their leader. They should come there to kneel and apologize. If they did things that way, maybe their lives would be spared. The men began to gather near our protagonist group, and one of them managed to recognize the symbol on their uniforms. Identifying them as disciples of Mount Hua, Mujin was telling our boy that this was not a peaceful approach, while he tried to teach everyone that breaking gates like that was the way things were done in Jianghu. Until a man who seemed to be the leader of those bandits stepped forward, asking what was causing so much commotion. One of the bandits told him those people seemed to be from the Mount Hua sect. That ended up making that man very worried. It didn't take long for him to notice they were only 4 young people. They were far too confident, and he asked our protagonist group if they wished to die trying to ambush them late at night. He said he was receiving an important guest and would let that offense pass, but our boy replied that they were the ones who would die that night. He told the man to watch how he spoke to him because it could cost him his life. life. The bandit said our protagonist must be out of his mind, asking if he knew who they were affiliated with. He then ordered his men to show those kids how terrible bandits could be. They all began to draw their weapons. They advanced toward our protagonist group in a dangerous way. It was at that moment that Manhwa saw something she wished she hadn't. Some people had been executed in that place, and judging by how the bandits behaved, they must have been innocent. She was utterly shocked by that sight, and she ran toward those bodies, leaving her companions worried. The girl did that hoping to find some kind of solution, but there was nothing that could be done to save those lives. Completely unaware of the carnage that was about to begin in that place, the girl stood frozen on the ground, leaving her companions visibly distressed. Because near her, 2 bandits were preparing to end her life. What they didn't expect was that this girl reacted brutally, using an open palm strike that sent them flying. Those bandits, with their poor martial skill, couldn't withstand that attack. Before her, they were nothing but simple ants. Mujin and Sheol managed to get close to her safely, and at first began to scold the girl because she shouldn't have strayed away so recklessly. She said those people were in very serious condition and needed treatment immediately. One of the bandits began to get up, saying they wouldn't be taking those beaten people. He began telling his comrades that those intruders might be martial artists, but they were weak, and they could win if they united. The bandit leader saw all the commotion, but our protagonist didn't move away from him. Our boy noticed that Manhwa had attacked without using all her power, just as she did in training, and shouting from where he was, he began to reprimand her, saying a sword is not for decoration. She needed to kill those scum. The bandit leader started mocking our boy for not leaving his place to help his subordinates. Looking at his expression, it seemed like he was bored with the situation. In truth, our boy was frustrated with his team's performance. The bandit decided he would help his men kill the others and then finish off our protagonist, because his instinct told him that one must be stronger. Our boy didn't know why he had been left alone, but he didn't care. This was the situation he wanted from the start. It was the first time his companions were in Jangu, and they didn't know how things worked beyond the sect walls. Mujin was having some difficulty. Someone threw mud toward his eyes. He managed to defend himself, but right after, he was hit by a kick. Our boy knew his companions weren't used to that kind of attack because these people truly wanted to take their lives. Things were different now. It wasn't like the massacre, when the first generation disciples were there to protect them. This time, they would have to fight for real. If there wasn't determination in their strikes, they would end up dead. Mujin was on the ground and had to block a sword strike to preserve his own life. This was completely different from training. They needed to learn that life and death aren't decided by martial skill alone. Looking at Sheol, our boy reached other conclusions, because he seemed to be handling the situation very well, defeating several of the bandits. While holding one of them by the head, an enraged bald man decided to attack him. Sheol dropped that bandit's body to the ground, and the edge of the sword was already aimed at him, but he managed to block that strike, spinning with a powerful blow that crushed the bald man's face. That was enough to make him fall unconscious at the feet of the bandit leader, who began to panic, realizing that Sheol was getting closer and closer to him. That young man was definitely threatening. Our boy noticed the bandit leader was walking back toward him. He believed he had been wrong, assuming our protagonist was the weaker opponent and he would defeat the weakest first. There wasn't even time for a fight. The bandit leader was simply humiliated, and those who were still alive realized what had just happened. For they didn't know what to do in that situation, since all those enemies were truly formidable. An old man who had been watching all this said they could just choose another. He declared that whichever bandit killed those intruders would be the new leader. Now they should stop being dramatic and finish the job. That was the Red Sword Wolf. Now our protagonist team knew exactly who they were dealing with. Our boy looked at that man and said he had been expecting him to appear. As soon as he was called by his title, the old man was surprised. He hadn't imagined those youths knew him. He said he was honored by that, but our protagonist quickly corrected him. He said he'd only learned of his existence the day before, making it clear he wasn't all that famous. Besides, he didn't bother to learn the name of every weakling he met. The old man said that a disciple of an orthodox sect should adhere to tradition, but that boy talked like someone from a demonic cult. He then threw his cup to the ground, and stepping into that battle stance, he said our protagonist would have to bear the weight of his own words. Even in the face of that man's challenge, our boy remained completely calm. In the blink of an eye, he was already behind the old man, asking if he was strong enough to oppress him. The Red Sword Demon turned around, trying to understand what had happened, but was brutally struck on the edge of the ear, falling to the ground immediately after. He used the inertia of the impact to spring to his feet, flipping backward, while trying to understand how that young man could be so fast, because he hadn't been able to see that figure move at all. And worst of all, his enemy hadn't even begun to use his sword. Trying to calm himself, he began to believe that young man couldn't possibly be on a higher level than him. There had to be some explanation, and our boy thought there was no reason to spare that man's life. But he would take this opportunity to test his own swordsmanship. It had been a month since he had taken control of that body. Since then, he had never stopped training, trying to perfect his technique with that of the sect. He had not yet been able to prove the effectiveness of his research. His team was not strong enough yet, and the elders and first-generation disciples had no time for him. That's why that enemy was so precious. Even though she was far from his expectations, it was still a training opportunity, and the old man leaped into the air ready to attack our boy. He came down on him with a deadly strike, but our boy dodged it with great ease. Another strike followed, this time a horizontal slash. But all of that was far too slow for our protagonist. He took advantage of that huge opening to strike the old man's chest with an open palm blow, and he managed to push him several meters away. Before his enemy could even recover, our protagonist kept up the pressure at every instant. The old man realized he had almost lost a piece of his head. On top of that, all his movements were being intercepted, while he himself saw almost nothing. That was more than enough for him to realize there was a huge difference in levels there. But his pride kept him from believing the obvious. Taking an offensive stance, the old man acknowledged our protagonist as something far beyond a mere young prospect and apologized for underestimating him. He said that from then on, he would use all his power. He began to run furiously toward the boy, but our protagonist showed no reaction at all. That old man was able to conjure a beast with his inner energy. Our protagonist's team became very worried at that sight, but all he did was cut through that creature using a basic Huasek technique, completely destroying the energy strike, telling the old man that it was very fierce, but also full of openings. And judging by the execution he had just witnessed, the old man hadn't even been able to fully master that technique. Completely speechless, the old man tried to ask how the boy knew that, but the answer came to him in the form of several strikes. One of them managed to graze his arm superficially. That left the old man very confused because he was sure he had blocked them all. Now he didn't know if it was the sword illusion technique or simply a strike far too fast. Without him noticing, the strike passed right at the level of his jaw. Everyone was left speechless at that scene. A few strands of hair fell, along with a reasonable amount of blood. That old man, who already had a bizarre appearance, looked even more ridiculous, receiving an unusual haircut. But he had enough skill to notice that our protagonist had turned his sword at the last moment, so as not to cut his head off. Realizing that he had been acting like that since the beginning of the fight, the boy was going easy on him. Even though he didn't know the reason that motivated our protagonist, the old man became curious about something else. He wanted to know how someone so young could be so powerful. Thinking that maybe he was just a talented person, he started to get furious. He said that the talented are usually all alike, and he couldn't accept that our boy was better than him, who had lived far longer. Saying that he was a martial artist of the 9 hells, he unleashed another devastating inner energy attack on our protagonist. Those beasts were getting closer and closer, and once again, all of them were contained with just a single move from our boy, which was strong enough to reach that old man. Heel watched that last exchange between them in great surprise. The old man had been defeated. Before that boy was even born, he had been training, and he had continued on that path so that one day he could be recognized among the best. But his decades of training amounted to nothing before that anniversary. Knowing that his effort wasn't recognized left him furious. But our protagonist had no time for monologues from secondary characters, so he made sure to cut him down immediately. Hey everyone, did you enjoy this story? I really liked it. If you want to follow the next part, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you in the next story, guys.